friends, and thanks for checking out the Reimagining Short-Term Missions podcast. If you're anything like me, you don't commit to listening to a podcast without first getting a good sense of who is podcasting and what the podcast is really about. This is a quick intro episode that should help you decide. I'm Forrest Inslee, a professor of International Community Development at Northwest University in Seattle. I'm the co-editor of a book called Reimagining Short-Term Missions, which is also the title of our show. Both book and podcast feature bold new ideas from folks all around the world who are challenging old assumptions and practices that have characterized the short-term missions industry. The pandemic brought short-term missions trips to a standstill for a time. Now, as we're recording this limited series podcast, global travel is opening up again. However, the folks featured in this podcast believe that instead of going back to the same old, this is a time to pause and reevaluate and ask ourselves, what have we been doing in the name of short-term missions, and what should we be doing in the future? This podcast is intended to help you and your faith community to answer these critical questions. If you're checking this podcast out, chances are you already believe that the practices of short-term missions are in need of serious reform. Even before the pandemic, there had been growing energy for a broad rethinking of the STM industry. Many are calling for increased creativity, contextuality, and mutuality. As the criticism regarding short-term missions becomes more accepted, there are courageous practitioners who have not lost hope, but instead have begun experimenting with new approaches that challenge the status quo and offer new ways forward. A lot of those folks have collaborated to write the book called Reimagining Short-Term Missions. This podcast features some of those voices and offers a platform for visionaries who are calling for better ways for the church to engage the world. By sharing their experiences and conversation, our hope is to foster a dynamic of critical rethinking and creative reimagining about the ways the global body of believers might work together to figure out better theology and practice when it comes to short-term missions. So that is what this podcast is all about. And who is this podcast for? Well, this is a podcast for those who are sometimes skeptical or disappointed by the failures of past STM practices. It's also a podcast for those who desire to advocate for change but may not know what change looks like. This is a podcast for discontented missions pastors and youth group leaders who feel compelled to do something in the realm of cross-cultural missions, yet don't want to employ the same tired models that they know are ineffective at best. This podcast also aims to equip Christian college missions and volunteerism coordinators who wish to create formational travel experiences, but also want to minimize cultural disruption and harm that short-term trips often cause. This is a podcast that seeks to dispel false narratives of cultural and economic superiority and equip people for humble, informed, responsible global citizenship. Importantly, the voices represented in this podcast aim to give hope to those on the receiving end of STMs as well. The representatives of host cultures who long to see better investment of resources, to see their people less disrupted and dishonored by current praxis, and to dream of more collaborative, co-equal relationships with their partner churches in the West. We think that it's time for truth-speaking in love. It's time to confront bad practice that oppresses and dishonors people and reinforces inequalities. We are all part of one church. We're all of equal worth in God's eyes. We need one another's differences in order to think and act rightly. These are not the ideas that most short-term mission activities reflect today, and the global church needs to design radical alternatives. That's what we're about, friends. So please join us for these challenging, creatively disruptive conversations on the Reimagining Short-Term Missions podcast.
You've been listening to the Reimagining Short-Term Missions podcast. If you want to explore more diverse and challenging perspectives like this, check out a new book called Reimagining Short-Term Missions, which includes chapters written by our podcast guests and from many more STM innovators from around the world. Your podcast host is Forrest Inslee, co-editor of that book and a professor of global studies at Northwest University in Seattle. Angel Burns is the book's co-editor, and our podcast producer is Heath Hollinsby. Friends, what we need now is nothing short of a revolution in short-term missions. So please help us spread the word by sharing this podcast with others of like heart and mind. This is the time for reimagining short-term missions.